I'm going to call upon our next presenter, Professor Daniela Busciglio from the University of Oklahoma. Daniela, are you able to switch on your mic and do a little sound check as we switch over?
Hi, yes, I've unmuted my mic. Can you hear me?
Yes, your sound is quite good.
Fabulous. Okay, I will begin to share my screen.
So everybody, to give you a little bit of background, Professor Busciglio is going to present the story of a project that she designed through her experience with the National Foreign Language Resource Center's Professional Development Series previously, and is going to report on that project.
Great. Okay, so my screen is good. You can see it?
Yes, looks good.
Wonderful. Okay. Hello, everyone. As Stephen mentioned, my name is Daniela Busciglio. And first of all, thank you so much for registering for this online symposium and for listening to my presentation. And thank you to everyone at the NFLRC as well for inviting me to present today. I'm just honored and thrilled to be able to join you and tell you about my experience in this project design over the next 30 minutes or so. Just a brief introduction about myself. I'm an assistant professor of Italian and second language acquisition at the University of Oklahoma, where I also direct the Italian language program, and I also am the World Language Education Liaison for the University of Oklahoma, or known as OU. I teach SLA as well as principles and techniques of teaching foreign languages at the undergrad and graduate levels. And I also teach courses in Italian language, literature, and cinema. I wear a couple of hats. And I also teach a course for Kane University in my home state of New Jersey, a graduate level SLA course. So I've been fascinated with PBLL since I found out what it was about 6 years ago, and I've been implementing PBL projects in various collegiate level Italian courses for about the past 5 years, since I was a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I love it so much that I ended up writing my entire dissertation on PBLL, in fact. So let's get right to it. Let's see. So a peek into my presentation today. There's 3 main components. So first, I want to talk about interculturality as an underlying theme. And I will also give you an overview of the project design that I created as a participant in the fundamentals of PBLL last year, and I fleshed out in the Intensive Summer Institute this past summer at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And at the end of the presentation, I'll include a link to the project in the Pebbles repository so you can really see the phases and the project structure and all the tasks in much more detail. And so the other component that I'll focus on is this sort of strands, as I like to call it, or sort of tracks in PBLL design, and how I sort of created flexible design templates, and something hopefully that will be useful for you as you think about creating your projects for various classes or for various courses that you teach. Now, the flexibility to accommodate the design, not only to according to the needs of students, but it's also for a variety of items such as their own interests, their strengths, their proficiency levels. So in this way, you too hopefully can begin to think about how you can develop different tracks or strands. Okay, so first up, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this idea of interculturality and how it can really be highlighted in PBLL. So the underlying element or notion that I really wanted to get at with this project was culture as organism, culture as a living, breathing thing. It's alive. And so I listed a bunch of adjectives, right, to describe culture. dynamic, evolving, morphing, mutable, nuanced, and textured. So culture in this view is a mutable substance, both tangible and intangible, and it's created, generated, produced by people. So as people change, ideas change, so does culture, right? Now, when we talk about interculturality, I'll briefly paraphrase a definition given by the NCSSFL, the National Council of State Supervisors for Languages. And so it's really about the interaction of people from different cultural backgrounds in such a way that promotes and demonstrates not just awareness, but also knowledge and understanding of different cultures in a genuine, authentic, hopefully reciprocated and appropriate way. And it fosters this curiosity and open-mindedness. That's where it really begins about that person and their culture or cultures. Then beyond this knowledge and understanding, the critical point is that language learners reflect on and evaluate their own feelings, thoughts, beliefs, perceptions, reactions, so as to better understand the other, quote unquote. And they use that experience to reflect on their own life and their own environment and surroundings and circumstances. So after all, it is through reflecting on experience that we truly learn. So in PBLL, of course, this requires appropriate language usage in communicative contexts, such that learners and language users are able to appropriately relate and gain understanding of the various products, perspectives, and practices, right? Using the actual 3 Ps of culture that's embodied in that word, culture, in a way that's personally relevant and meaningful for them. So it's important to also point out here that for our students, different cultural backgrounds can, of course, involve people from that same country, the same region, the same state, same town or city, in fact. Interculturality can be completely borderless. Like the image at the bottom of the slide here, culture is how we swim together, and oceans are certainly borderless. Culture is also what happens when we just keep swimming. A little bit more on interculturality, as not to get too theoretical, but as poetic journey. So I'm doing a little bit of a backwards trek here, but bear with me here. So in the wonderful feedback I received on my project design, there was this fabulous chart that I've included here on the facets of interculturality and key points about each of them. So just as we must have some grounding beliefs and principles about our teaching and how we teach before we develop techniques and specific methods with which to teach, likewise, for this presentation, I think it's essential to kind of further develop this notion of what interculturality really is and really involves, which to me, at least, it is a journey that is simultaneously inward and outward. So a journey of the self through the other as well. So this notion is really of autopoiesis is actually quite strikingly similar to interculturality. And it was actually initially developed by some biologists that were longing to describe the chemistry of living cells. It's since been applied to sociological theories and systems theory. Just going to briefly go to the quote at the bottom of the slide about these autopoietic structures, since that is the relevant part to interculturality. And I'll just read it. So autopoietic structures have definite boundaries, such as a semi-permeable membrane, but the boundaries are open and connect the system with almost unimaginable complexity to the world around it. So again, it's essentially about recognizing, acknowledging the other through oneself, and ultimately being personally transformed by that experience of the other and the other's culture. So if we can briefly imagine these different facets from the initial stage of interculturality up top about this awareness of other, moving to tolerance, then to sympathy, right? And these higher order levels of empathy and eventually personal transformation. In the chart that follows, you can see some of the different skills, as they were, and capacities that are really necessary to foment and proceed along this line towards empathy and eventually personal transformation. So they include, as you can see, attitudes, knowledge, skills of interpreting and relating, skills of discovery and interaction, as well as a more abstract capacity of critical cultural awareness. So to sort of zoom out metaphorically and bring this into perspective a bit more, we might say that what we do as language teachers is really fundamentally about welcoming the other, welcoming the foreign, the strange, and recognizing the other in ourselves, which we can categorize as empathy, and letting that learning experience transform us. So moving on to my next slide, we have PBLL Italian style. So now I'd like to give you an overview of the project that I began to design last year. It's still going through various iterations, as happens with PBLL. So as I mentioned before, I began designing this project in the fundamentals of PBLL, the online institute, and I really fleshed it out much more during the week-long intensive summer institute at the University of Hawaii, Manoa, this past summer, where the theme was, of course, interculturality. Just to give you a little bit of background, I've been teaching Italian and ESL for over 10 years now. And as you can imagine, food is a very hot topic for students of Italian for good reason. Food is glorious. And of course, Italians are known for lots of F's, namely family, fashion, and food. Of course, that's to say nothing about art and architecture, but those are entirely different topics for other PBLL experiences and projects, right? But as we know, few things interest students as much as food. Same goes for me. But with this project, I really wanted to figure out a way to get away from a stereotypical, sort of static, fixed notion of food and food cultures in Italy, as students perceive of them as such as just pasta and pizza and gelato, ice cream, right? Goes way beyond that. But how could I do this in a way that's way more relevant and meaningful on a personal level to each individual student? How can we begin to delve into such a large topic such as food and make it really relevant and interesting and make it local? So that's one of the requirements in this project that I kind of foisted upon myself, to make the global local. At least that's where we start at first. So we have to start with students' local experiences and their local funds of knowledge before scaling up and out. And you might think of the cone, the inverted pyramid of the proficiency guidelines, that same type of inverted pyramid that we're also using as a model in this PBLL project in order to scaffold to larger, more abstract concepts and cultural notions about food and food cultures. Now, I have some years of implementing PBL in the language classroom, but I wanted to also experiment a little bit more with a flexible, possibly modular design that would allow for a higher degree of student voice and choice, as well as authenticity, and those fit hand in hand. And this is one of this camera lens graphic from the Buck Institute for Education is one of my favorite graphics to include in my presentations, which you also just saw in Lauren's wonderful presentation. So now I will talk a little bit about this cultural interplay of food cultures that are very geographically, spatially located, right, through space and through time. Now, so I began to think about a very pervasive food culture that was born here in the US, fast food, of course, which is now a global phenomenon. Now, I put up a map of Italy, and regional specialties, food specialties, to further contextualize and sort of get more local with the idea of food cultures in Italy. So here we can see a small amount of different delicious special dishes in the 20 regions or 20 states as they were in Italy. So this is if we want to say local, that's okay. We can also say a regional level of food and food cultural knowledge. And I've also included a really provocative statement that didn't come from me, but that I read online, but I consider a pretty valid argument or point of view if we're attempting to examine food culture more in depth. So, eating regionally in Italy, there's no such thing as Italian food. Well, how's that? What about pasta? What about pizza? Well, if we briefly think about the origins of those foods, they can't be Italian, and they aren't Italian, in fact. So while there might be some unifying elements that help define at least modern Italian cuisine at a national, a global, or at a global level, this helps really put things into perspective without going into the depth of or origins of food culture and food history. So we can also imagine this in many other countries as well. Take India, for example, with 29 different states, 7 union territories, the same sort of richness in this textured tapestry of food cultures that exists there as well. And so, as the world has become smaller as a result of globalization, these boundaries or confines we once perceived of are becoming much more permeable. And now there's a whole lot of fast food in Italy, perhaps still less in comparison to many other countries. But now we'll begin to see a little bit of an overview of the project design and how we began to examine these two notions in the project in the entry event specifically. So what really inspired my project was this particular entry, which I'll explain to you, which I took screenshots of. Of course, there are 2 videos that I have students watch and do activities on before, during, and after the video viewings. This was an event that continues to shake Italian culture and food cultures even today. You might say it created a sort of food war. It most definitely created an uproar in Italian society, especially in Naples, which is in the southern part of Italy. So what happened was there was a commercial released by McDonald's a few years ago, specifically catered to a Neapolitan audience, where a small child that you can see on the left here is with his parents in a local Neapolitan pizzeria. And he tells his parents, as they're about to order, that he wants a Happy Meal. And the next scene is of the parents and the child at a local McDonald's ordering a Happy Meal. As a result of this commercial, McDonald's was the recipient of much backlash from people all around Italy, including various organizations such as the Pizza Makers Organization of Naples, as well as various news outlets all over Italy. And on the right side, I have taken some screenshots of the sort of counter commercial that was put together by a famous Neapolitan food blogger who is the king of street food, also uploaded to YouTube, that then went viral on social media. This backlash was so intense that McDonald's retracted that commercial on the left, and they apologized for it as well, for being quote unquote anti-pizza. However you might interpret this string of events, it's quite undeniable that the wave of reactions was no doubt a clear testament to the mighty strength of the fabric of Italian food culture, which is a force to be reckoned with. So on the right side, as you can see, the top right side, this little boy, Neapolitan little boy, is pretty angry that his dad brought him to McDonald's. And then at the bottom, he says, "Dad, what is this?" which is not an exact translation of what he says in the Neapolitan dialect. I want pizza, Neapolitan pizza specifically. So the students that begin with this entry event in this project, they begin their excavation of a little bit of a deeper knowledge of Italian food cultures with a very specific scandal of an event that happened very recently. And they begin to build lists of vocabulary, phrases, loaner words, right, like such as Happy Meal, which is the same in Italian, although they don't aspirate the H, so it sounds more like Happy Meal, for example. So these words that have to do with ordering food and food items at a fast food restaurant, at another type of restaurant, such as a pizzeria, specifically in or around Naples, in addition to examining language usage in these commercials, because, as I mentioned before, the child is on the right is actually speaking the local Neapolitan dialect, not standard Italian. So there's a lot of opportunities and items right within this entry event to use as a platform or a diving board right into the projects. And this is, even within the entry event, there are opportunities for students to initially reflect on what's happening in these events, even in terms of accent, for example, and usage of dialects, for example. So moving on to some of the challenging questions, I've listed several of them that one of them I've come up with, and the other two that have come through feedback in various iterations of the project as well. Now, I want to preface this slide by telling you that I initially designed this project with an intermediate Italian language course in mind, such as third semester at an American university, but with an eye toward being able to modify, right, to create a more modular project for other levels, other proficiencies, etc. And over the course of the past 8 months, and with wonderful feedback from the NFLRC, especially from Stephen, I've been able to delineate several challenging questions that create more flexibility and more universality, as you can see, for the students to examine and reflect upon local food culture and health habits while learning about and investigating these same topics in other nations, such as Italy or beyond. So the challenging questions for this project could be one of the following, or you can also have different groups work on different challenging questions and also producing different public products. So the first question that it came up with, which is very specific, is what are some of the effects of American fast food chains and processed food products in Italy, and how might the influence of American fast food chains in Italy be affecting Italian food culture, rates of obesity, even modern Italian family values? It's very pointed and it's a mouthful. What about question number 2? Why do we eat fast food if it's so bad for us? So very broad and universal. And the third one, how can we critically examine our attraction to certain kinds of foods and gain control over our own eating choices? So they're purposefully, question 2 and 3 are purposefully much more open, much more malleable, which allows for, again, a lot more, hopefully, authentic products and a lot more student voice and choice of where they choose to go with their products. As Lauren also showed in her presentations, is another one of my very favorite graphics from the new Tech Network, which is what project-based learning would look like on a day-to-day basis in your classroom. So if the project launch includes an entry event, for example, like I just showed you, then you would use that as a launching point for other activities, for other worksheets, or even for short lectures, and for building in homework activities as well, and further research to dig into how they might research food habits, health habits, etc. I'm going to skip over this because Lauren did such a good job in explaining this, and I should probably work on saving some time. So I'll talk now about several of the project phases and tasks. Again, this is a very general overview, and at the end, you'll have a link to the Pebbles repository where you can see the project in much more detail, including specific tasks within each of the phases. So just to briefly talk again about the sort of strands or tracks, and I'll get back to that eventually as well. The reason why I decided to create this design with tracks in mind is because I wasn't actually sure that I was going to be scheduled to teach an intermediate Italian language course in which I could launch this project. So I wanted to create this more modular approach. So in this way, I could actually take chunks of the project and implement them if I wasn't able to execute the entire thing. Well, as luck would have it, instead of teaching an intermediate Italian course, I ended up teaching an Italian conversation course and doing exactly that. So taking some components of this project and implementing them according to proficiency level, according to what the students wanted to delve into more, what they found more interesting. And it was a very small course. There were only 6 or 7 students. So there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what they wanted to choose to investigate. Okay, so talking a little bit about these different phases. So in this slide, after the entry event, students are launching the project and they're still in this local phase. And one of their first tasks is to begin right in their own home, in their own community, and observe their own eating and health habits through a log, a food diary. It could be manual by hand, written in a book, or it could be on a platform or an app such as MyFitnessPal, which has a social media aspect to it in which you can share your food diary, your goals, so forth and so on. And so after several days or a week of this personal data collection from each individual student of where they're eating, what they're eating, and their general health habits, maybe they're going to the gym on campus, they can actually begin to see how much, if any, fast food they might eat on a regular basis. This actually might even go into a discussion of what is considered fast food. Is all fast food unhealthy? Which are the best, which are the worst fast food chains. So maybe students might choose to draw a spectrum of fast food chains from healthiest to least healthy in order to gauge and rank the sort of food habits. So already we might even delve into an activity where we would be either learning or reviewing comparatives or superlatives, which is perfect for an intermediate Italian language course. So in the second step, students are now beginning to explore what fast food looks like abroad in Italy. So it's not that McDonald's are simply uprooted and transported to Italy. They look completely different. So how many McDonald's are there? Do they still have the golden arches, for example? Are the restaurants more stylish? Well, yes, but the students don't know that quite yet. Are their items more or less expensive? Are they different than the items we typically have in McDonald's menus? So there's a lot of interdisciplinary components that are also involved in these sorts of questions, as you might already see on this slide. So for example, if they're looking at prices and comparing them to American prices, they're going to have to do some math or use at least a conversion website to see the comparison between dollars and euros, for instance. Maybe even use statistics. I don't know. And the language component certainly would be built around forming and answering these sort of detailed question words. And making sure they're using question words appropriately to ask and answer questions. So in phase 2, it involves sort of an additional layer. It's kind of like a project that accumulates in complexity as we go along. We are pretty fortunate because we have a partner school in Arezzo, which is just outside of Florence, where our university also has a campus study center. And so we can communicate with native speakers, with students of Italian at a local high school there. So in phase 2, students begin to build an interview protocol now that they have some information about fast food chains in Italy. And so they want to start asking these partner school students about their eating and health habits so that they can compare and contrast to their own. So do they eat fast food, for example? At which fast food chains? How often? How many fast food places are there specifically in Arezzo? And so on and so forth. So after this comes some data collection with these questions, which can be done in a variety of ways. And tools such as Google Forms are great things to use. And there are myriad free tech tools out there to use. And the results end up being processed and summarized by the students, again, all using target language. These are wonderful opportunities for just-in-time teaching where you're introducing specific sorts of phrases that one would use when you are presenting results or using summary material. So along the way, teachers also need to constantly assess where students might need some critical scaffolding of language components, right? Not just for accuracy, but also providing lexical items and vocabulary where needed. And you also want to make sure that you are helping them navigate these sort of personal issues of health and food habits with a degree of professionality. How different cultures discuss issues of personal health and food habits is also very different. In Italy, for example, it's very acceptable to talk about your weight, to ask about someone's weight if they lost or gained weight, even if it's an acquaintance. In American culture, I'd venture to say that that is very much not the case. So these are all things that could be included, for example, in a short lecture to talk about these sort of cultural differences that wouldn't be apparent to your students otherwise. So after this, students can gather these results, compare, contrast with their own data summary, and begin to hypothesize, extrapolate, and what might account for these differences or what might account for similarities in the results. So moving on to phase 3, which can be an interview or a presentation phase, and I'll go into this more on the next slide. Students can choose from a variety of public products with which to present their results to this partner school audience. So I've listed a bunch of appropriate public products here that I'll show you in just a moment. That depends on really the proficiency level of the students. So here are some of what I like to call these strands, depending on different levels or different goals. So for novice level students, this is a doable project, and they might want to create something such as infographics of what they've learned. So doing a little bit of number crunching and including some basic information, maybe not full phrases, bullet points, like you see in infographics, about what fast food looks like and what the culture looks like for teenagers or people in their young 20s in Italy and in the US. So for the rest of the ideas or strands that I came up with, they involve more intermediate level, low intermediate to advanced level proficiencies. For example, you could create a Facebook group page where students can communicate, obviously asynchronously, and even posting some infographics that they've created, incorporating that and commenting on or asking further questions about these results that they came up with. Another one, much more dynamic, I would say, is creating some Instagram videos in which they ask questions or further questions and obtain responses from their audience. on Instagram, or the audience could comment on their Instagram accounts as well. So written or video posts. Another idea, have 8 to 10 minute long podcasts in which they talk about the results of their projects and information that they gathered, and cultural contrast, for example. And again, students can respond with a short response podcast, or they can comment, and tools such as SoundCloud are fabulous for that. Another one that I've listed is doing semi-structured interviews with partner schools. With the partner school, which obviously would have to be a synchronous activity, which would require also a high degree of preparation for that interview. One of the difficulties, of course, is always the time change. So here we're 7 hours behind Italy. So when I have class, unfortunately, it's already 10 p.m. at night in Italy. And so finding a time where we can link up for Skype interviews is not the easiest thing. Therefore, you have some other asynchronous options. So before I talk a little bit more about this, I'll just say here that there is a phase 4, which I did not include in this presentation, which is basically the epilogue phase, and wrapping up the project and doing a final assessment and final reflection on their learning, not only the language component, but obviously also the cultural components or interculturality components of the project, and on the cultivation of cultural awareness throughout the project and how it hopefully expanded through their research and their interviewing processes. As we know, in terms of the public product, audiences can be a hard thing to find. As you know, I'm located in Oklahoma. There aren't any Italian-speaking communities, but the digital age is a wonderful way to get over this hurdle, especially through social media, where learners can join the larger conversation, as it were, in these multimodal ways, whether it's simply writing messages of 140 characters or less on Twitter, posting a video on Instagram, etc. So this is part of the reason why I've chosen to include these different sorts of ideas of what students can do with these projects. And you can also choose to have different groups produce different public products. It depends on how comfortable you feel with your expertise in PBLL. I certainly don't consider myself an expert, but I think of teaching as an experiment, and I believe in failing forward. So one really great idea for more of an interactive public product would be to, for example, for the novice product and posting an infographic in a social media campaign, would be to publish it on a platform like Reddit or like imgur.com. Perhaps you've heard of those websites, where you can actually upvote the image or infographic that most deeply resonates with the audience, for example, or most accurately represents their cultural practices and perspectives, for example. So this is a different way to interact with the project to make it even more engaging.
Daniela, we're almost out of time. So
here's my last slide.
Okay.
So as a final comment, I just want to emphasize that even though we do produce a public product, PBL is very much about process. It's an iterative process, indeed, similar kind of like to a fractal or geometric figure whose patterns repeat and recur. So the key is to tackling bigger, more abstract or global topics and concepts is really to begin locally, to act locally in scaffolding from there. So the next tip, which Stephen recently told me, that there's, of course, which I believe too, there's no perfect PBL, and this is also the beauty of it. And I actually encourage my students to fail, because I believe that fail really means first attempt in learning. So I encourage you to keep on playing around with different iteration, with different ideas with your projects. And I hope this has been helpful for you. And my email is there, and there is the link to the details on my project that I designed. And thank you so much for listening to my presentation.